Deep in a forest of Eastern Europe lie the remains of a bizarre Nazi experiment. A plan so strange that only now can the full story be told.
They had this huge ambition to time travel back and try and recreate something which has not been in existence for 9,000 years.
Scientists from the SS devised a plan to recreate prehistoric animals that had vanished from the Earth. Beasts, the new Nazi super race, can hunt in ancient forests across Europe. A master plan from the master race, and they're prepared to kill to make it happen.
It was a struggle for life and death, the beginning of a process which Hitler and other Nazis then called the final solution.
This is the true and astonishing story of how Nazis sought to control nature, the essence of evolution. July 1941. In a remote part of eastern Poland, the infamous Order Police Battalion 322 begins hunting down and deporting thousands of people from the newly captured forest of Bialovieza. Anyone who resists is to be shot.
The war diary of this Battalion 322 of the Order Police is a really remarkable document. It is horribly candid about the poor luckless villagers in the Bialovieza forest. They are either being systematically deported, forcibly removed from their homes and transported to an uncertain fate, or they are being cold-bloodedly murdered and buried in mass graves.
Illustrated with its own photographs, the war diary records that in the 7 days between July 25th and August 1st, 1941, the battalion burns down 34 villages and expels over 7,000 people. That includes the horrors befallen upon the people living in the small forest village of Budia.
This photo is taken in July 1941 when they were burning the houses. This is what you see. It's a flat, completely flat, like in the picture, and it's a very, very big opening. 183 families, almost 1,000 people were deported. Few persons were shot because they were too slowly moving away.
The thorough and brutal cleaning of this faraway forest is no ordinary operation. It's part of a secret Nazi project, which is only now coming to light.
The population of the primeval forest of Bialovieza is to be deported. This forest is to be a nature reserve for Reich Marshal Hermann Göring.
Hermann Göring, one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich, is Hitler's deputy and commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. As Germany's master of the hunt, he knows Bialovieza well, having shot game in the forest before the war as a guest of the Polish government. But for Nazi leaders like Göring, this forest has a significance that goes to the very heart of Nazi ideology.
Within only days of the invasion of the Soviet Union, Göring is making sure that he has seized this forest as his own to be protected. There's no doubt in my mind that before the invasion of the Soviet Union, he had earmarked this as an area that he wanted to secure for his own purposes.
Situated in eastern Poland, Bialovieza is to be incorporated into the new German Reich. To the Nazis, this forest is considered sacred. It is Urwald, primeval forest, an ancient wilderness stretching roughly 580 square miles. Bialovieza is also the last refuge of Europe's rarest game animals. It shelters packs of wolves, the elusive Eurasian lynx, the European moose, and some of the last surviving European bison, the powerful animal revered by the Germans as the Wisent. These are animals that the Nazis believe their Aryan ancestors hunted thousands of years ago, in the forests where they forged their racial identity.
I think the lure of the wild has been stronger in Germany than anywhere else. You can see that back in Roman times when the Roman historian Tacitus spoke of the Germans as the people of the forest, the purest race in Europe, who hadn't mixed with anybody else. Tacitus writes of the Germans, and they appear as a distinct, unmixed race, like no one but themselves. All have fierce blue eyes, copper-colored hair, and huge frames.
The great forests of Germania, celebrated by Tacitus, have been enshrined in German history for hundreds of years and is central to the upbringing of young Germans alongside the tales of Siegfried, the great warrior slayer of wild beasts.
The identification of the German people as a group who came from the forest, who derived from the forest, whose mental and physical qualities appeared connected with their life as forest dwellers, was absolutely central. This is a strand which fed into the Nazi vision of their future Third Reich.
After Adolf Hitler, Hermann Goering is the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. And Goering takes full advantage of his position as national master of hunting, sparing no expense in promoting the activity in German culture and at international hunting exhibitions. This remarkable photograph, taken 2 years before the Second World War, shows Goering and a group of hunting officials gazing at a model of the Bialovieza forest.
I think what's really extraordinary about this photograph is that we can see these men actually looking at a model of this forest some years before Poland was attacked and occupied. I think it's not over-imaginative to think of certain of the Nazis, and Goering comes to mind here particularly, as casting greedy eyes upon this forest and seeing it as the ideal place to realize their visions of a huge primeval forest which could be cleared of undesirable inhabitants and restocked with wild animals suitable for hunting.
The picture also shows another Nazi with the power to transform Goering's vision beyond his wildest dreams, Dr. Lutz Heck, zoologist and member of the SS. 5 years before the Nazis came to power, Lutz Heck and his brother Heinz began work on a wildly ambitious project. Their plan? Breed wild beasts that haven't walked the earth for centuries. As zoologists, the Hecks have a strong pedigree. Their father, Ludwig Heck, and his brother were directors of the great zoos of Berlin and Munich.
The Heck family became a kind of dynasty of zookeepers. So Ludwig Heck, the father of Lutz and Heinz, had been the director of the Berlin Zoo for years, and he was a prominent figure, a prominent public figure in Germany.
Professor Dr. Lutz Heck is a very important person. His father was very big in terms of working with the research into bisons, and he and his brother decided to take this saving of animals to a new level.
Entranced by the romantic myths he's read since childhood, Lutz Heck and his brother dream of one day encountering one of these great beasts for themselves. Lutz Heck wrote,
"In my youth, my imagination was caught above all by 2 huge wild oxen, which have become most legendary and are regarded as the most powerful representatives of primeval German game, the Wisent and the Aurochs."
A few Wisents, or European bison, survived in the forest of Bialovieza. But the aurochs, the fabled wild and ferocious ancestor of modern cattle, has been extinct for hundreds of years. The real question is, what did they look like? Bioarchaeologists like Jackie Mulville have been excavating aurochs' remains in their ancestral home, the Middle East.
These are 2 skulls from Bronze Age aurochs, which means they were around a couple of thousand years before Christ. We have the skulls of 2, and we have the skeleton of the majority of this individual here. So you can see here laid out on the table some of the, sort of the giant ribs, the animal's jaw, its hips, and most interestingly perhaps, this is its scapula. So this is the shoulder blade of an aurochs. We can use the size of the aurochs bones to work out how tall they actually stood. So from archaeological evidence, we think that males possibly 160 to 180, females probably about 150 centimeters high. So I mean, kind of my size, really. The males were probably only a little bit smaller than me when they would come sort of my eye line. So they're big animals, and that's just their shoulders. So their heads would be considerably higher.
The skulls and skeletons of the aurochs dwarf those of domesticated cattle.
This animal is a similar period, so it's Bronze Age, about 2,000 years before Christ. But what you can see quite easily is the size difference between these two animals. The skull of this animal is much smaller, it's also much narrower, and also the horns, that you can see, are much, much reduced. Instead of coming out and sweeping out to the side and pointing forwards like the aurochs do, the domestic cattle have a much smaller horn core.
For thousands of years, the aurochs live alongside their tamer cousins before they are finally driven to extinction. The Heks believe that domestic cattle still retain the genetic key to recreating their larger ancestors.
The Heck brothers did believe that deep inside every domestic animal remained the beating heart of an aurochs.
Modern cattle, or modern farm animals, and modern humans for that matter, do contain many of the genes of their ancestors. That's what evolution is all about. We're all living fossils, that's us. And your average dairy cow is a living fossil of a much fiercer wild animal.
They had this huge ambition to time travel back and try and recreate something which had not been in existence for such a long time that it's incredibly difficult. They were trying to rewind back time. They were trying to go back about 9,000 years, which is when we first changed the aurochs into our domestic cattle.
The brothers research ancient descriptions of the aurochs, their size, color, and horn shapes. They use cave paintings from the mountains of Spain as inspiration. They study recently excavated skeletons. They decide that all the key traits of the aurochs are distributed amongst their various descendants.
What my brother and I now had to do was to unite in a single animal all those characteristics of the wild aurochs that are now found spread between different breeds of tame cattle. We then bred these animals with one another to eliminate all the characteristics of domestic cattle.
In effect, to recreate the huge size and violent characteristics of the aurochs, the Heks are experimenting with genetics. They're becoming mad scientists. But how far are they willing to take it? In 1928, Lutz and Heinz Heck's mission to create the legendary aurochs begins with a search across Europe for cattle with special traits. Lutz finds wild bulls in the hills of Corsica, muscular cattle from the Camargue in southern France, and fighting bulls from Seville. Heinz adds Hungarian breeds and rugged highland cattle from Scotland.
He was looking for animals that would have a particular horn shape or a particular coloration and also a particular behavior. Especially for the wild behavior that Lutz Heck was looking for, he went to Spain to get Spanish fighting cattle in order to create what in his mind would be a properly wild animal.
Applying state-of-the-art genetics for the time, the Heks believe they need to breed many generations of animals before they create offspring with the right mix of characteristics.
There was a sense that heredity was a process in which individual independent elements were combined in certain ways. And this allowed them to imagine that they could be reassembled in a way into a whole new animal.
Their attempts to create a perfect new breed chime with the ideology of the party that comes to power in 1933. Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Party begins introducing laws that define different levels of racial purity. They even use animal terms like crossbreed for children of mixed parentage. technical terms very familiar to Lutz Heck.
Lutz Heck particularly appears to me to be somebody who was thoroughly steeped in this sense of the German people as a distinct ethnic group with these distinct physical and mental characteristics. He was clearly absolutely in harmony with the Nazi ideology.
For Lutz Heck, this shared ideology with the Nazi leadership presents a new opportunity. The aurochs breeding program is well underway, but if he can get backing from the Nazis, it will transform his project and his career.
Lutz Heck, right after the start of the Nazi party coming to power, became a so-called paying member of the SS, and he struck up a very friendly relations with Hermann Göring.
As Reichmaster of the Hunt, Hitler's deputy, Hermann Göring, is the natural target for the role as major benefactor for the aurochs breeding project. The key to the national hunt master's heart lay with young super predators.
Komm, ja, mein Cäsar. Kommst du mich besuchen? Mucki, kommst du mich besuchen, ja? Komm.
Heck keeps Göring supplied with lion cubs.
Cäsar. Los, schön, spring, hopp. So ist gut.
When they grow too large, he collects them and brings them back to the zoo. Very soon, Heck and Göring go out hunting together.
Göring fashioned himself as a hunter and tried to relive this mythical version of the Germanic knight. And he was happily carrying spears to hunt in the forest.
Heck's wooing pays off. Göring supports breeding projects for a whole menagerie of forest creatures. Another extinct animal that the Heck brothers try to recreate by backbreeding is the tarpan, the wild and aggressive ancestor of the modern horse. These two are designated as German beasts.
Dr. Lutz Heck vom Berliner Zoo, der Leiter der Fangexpedition.
With the Reich Marshal's generous funding, Lutz Heck begins importing moose and bison from North America. Nazis like Heck and Göring believe that new blood from wild North American breeds will add more vigor to degenerate old world hunting stock.
People like Hermann Göring and Lutz Heck respect only a wild, aggressive animal. And while domestic animals are acceptable, in regards to the animals which are being hunted, animals which are hand-reared and fed are categorized as degenerate beasts. And this is unacceptable to the senior hunter of all hunters in Germany, Hermann Göring.
Wild, aggressive, and independent animals are the goal of Lutz Heck's aurochs project. When bulls and cows produce weak and feeble offspring, they are eliminated from the program. It's a trademark of the Nazis that they applied to human beings as well. The Berlin Olympics of 1936 is Hitler's showcase for the strong and the fit. The Nazi organizers go to great efforts to celebrate the German body beautiful, displaying the streamlined figures of the supposed Aryan victors in the struggle for life. Hitler's Olympics is for winners, but behind the display, the losers, those deemed the racially impure and the mentally ill, are not only prevented from breeding, they are murdered.
I think it's an absolutely precise tie between Hitler's views of breeding from the best and killing off the worst, and the attempts to regenerate animals which supposedly were like those of a purer and more powerful past in their own history. Hitler wrote quite early in his career, in his book Mein Kampf, My Struggle, with chilling foresight as to what was going to happen to humans. Whoever is not bodily and spiritually healthy and worthy shall not have the right to pass on his suffering in the body of his children. That's exactly, precisely what was trying to be undertaken in the breeding program to get back to the perfect examples of cattle, of horses, and in the end of humans.
The Nazi fantasy of harnessing all nature to serve the Third Reich is terrifyingly real in this forest north of Berlin. Close to Sachsenhausen concentration camp lie the remains of the SS Hundschule, the breeding center and training ground for concentration camp guard dogs. The hounds of war they breed are proof that nature really can be turned to the will of its Nazi masters.
The German Shepherd represents to the Nazis one of their validating successes. You know, almost every high-ranking German official had their own German Shepherd. Even Hitler had German Shepherds, so it was a symbol for them of Germanness.
The German Shepherd becomes a world-conquering breed, so successful that they catch the eye of the head of the SS. Heinrich Himmler believes they are ideal guard dogs for the increasing numbers of political prisoners and Jews being herded into the new concentration camps like Sachsenhausen. One survivor of the camps would later provide chilling testimony about the use of SS-bred guard dogs.
After endless torment, the prisoners no longer had the strength to cover the 30 feet required to get back in line. Those who remained lying on the floor were taken to the camp kennels, where they became the main course for the ravenous German shepherds. With their sharp teeth, these vicious dogs tore apart the bodies of people who'd been thrown into the cages, still alive.
At the center of this Nazi ideology is Hermann Goering. He sponsors Lutz Heck's animal breeding program. He's also the man who signs the documents authorizing the final solution. In November 1937, he hosts a major international hunting exhibition in Berlin. This photograph, taken at the exhibition, shows Hermann Goering and Lutz Heck surveying a map of Bialovieza forest in Poland. In front of them is a gilded aurochs horn. Could it be that 2 years before the outbreak of war, Hermann Goering already has plans to seize this Polish forest and turn it into the new Germania, a home for Lutz Heck's recreated animals? The aurochs project reaches a critical stage. Although the animals look like their fierce ancestors, they are still dependent on humans to feed them. They have to be capable of surviving in the wild to be beasts worthy of Nazi huntsmen like Hermann Goering. So, in the autumn of 1938, Heck loads his beasts onto trains and transports them 300 miles from Berlin into Goering's hunting estate in the far eastern corner of Germany. Finally, after 14 years of this strange breeding experiment, the animals are released to see how they would fare in the wild.
The energy of our first wild cattle in the German forest and their innate beauty and strength aroused such enthusiasm that they were very soon left free to roam the moors of Rominter.
But other accounts from local people contradict Heck's claims about his animals' harmonious introduction into the forest. In reality, it's no longer safe to go down to the woods.
They're very violent and they're prone to attack passers-by. They even trash bicycles of the bicyclists that were there, according to reports. And especially what was problematic was that they disrupted the feeding of the deer. That was what concerned Goering and the hunters the most.
Soon after Heck's cattle begin their rule of terror in the forests of Rominter, the Germans launch their blitzkrieg on Poland. Due to Hitler's secret agreement with Stalin, the Soviet Union takes possession of the eastern half of Poland. The primeval forest of Bialovieza is still out of Goering's reach. For Lutz Heck, however, the war brings new opportunities. He's now free to loot animals from the zoos of the newly conquered countries to help his breeding programs. This is the only building in Warsaw Zoo to survive the war. In 1939, it was the home of the director and his wife, Jan and Antonina Zabinski. Soon after the German occupation, Dr. Lutz Heck comes knocking on their door.
Lutz Heck was a very important Nazi officer, and the visit was very official. Of course, this visit was probably very stressful to Zabinski and his family, and he came to give some important and official informations. The zoo will be liquidated, important animals, precious animals, will be sent to German zoos. They're still important animals for all the zoos from Europe. The rest of the animals will be killed.
Antonina Zabinski records her dismay that their favorite animals are to be plundered and liquidated. She and her husband failed to protect their animals from Lutz Heck's breeding programs, but they do save their Jewish friends from the brutal consequences of the Nazis' obsession with racial purity. When Lutz Heck pays his visit, he has no idea that Jewish families are hiding in the basement below.
I can't play piano, but Antonina Zabinski was a perfect pianist. And when she started to play something special, it was information to these people in the basement that here upstairs in the house is going something wrong, danger, and this was the signal: quiet, to hide, or to escape.
On June 22, 1941, the Germans launched their invasion of the Soviet Union, catching Stalin by surprise. Within days, the Nazis seize hundreds of thousands of square miles of Polish territory that has been occupied by the Russians. This includes the forest of Bialovieza.
I think we have to be mindful here of the absolutely vast spaces which the Germans did, in fact, take over in the summer and the autumn of 1941. And I think it's quite difficult, if one hasn't travelled there, to visualise these endless flat plains and forests and swamps, an absolutely vast area. And this provided the perfect place in which to develop German colonisation.
The German military victories aren't simply going to mean a human conquest. Senior Nazi planners prepare for a conquest by German nature, too. Foremost among these ideologues is Dr. Lutz Heck.
What Heck claimed was that the landscapes in the east had degraded due to the wrong type of inhabitants, and that by Germanizing the area, not just with German people, but also with German wildlife and German trees and German forests, that would restore the landscape to its original German state.
Although the forest of Bialovieza is on the extreme eastern borders of Poland, 300 miles from Berlin, it's annexed to German territory. This is the Nazis' opportunity to recreate the ancient forests of Germania, with Bialovieza becoming part of a vast forest system stretching to the coast. Goering's ambitions for the forest of Bialovieza is supported by another of Hitler's henchmen, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, the architect of the Holocaust. He, too, is a sponsor of Lutz Heck's animal experiments.
Himmler and the SS knew and understood and were in agreement with Goering's desire to see this area turned into a wildlife reserve and a huge sanctuary for animals. So they had no objection to that. They were, as I say, in sympathy with this, and they had no objection either to dispatching one of their units there early on to begin the process of ethnic cleansing in that region.
Within days of the German invasion, a unit of Himmler's execution squads, commanded by Goering's favorite huntsman, begins clearing the forest of its inhabitants. Finally, Goering's plans are in place. A Polish forest is primed to become German Jurassic Park. But first, it has to be ethnically cleansed. In the next 3 years, they would expel over 20,000 local people. And as evidence from their war diaries show, they also commit some of the first massacres of the Holocaust.
The Bialovieza forest is right at the sharp end of that process. It's one of the very first places where we see this happening. And we also see in the forest, perfectly modelled there, the various stages in the development of what Hitler and other Nazis then called the final solution.
These Jewish cemeteries are the only remains of Jewish communities that had lived in the forest since the 18th century. Within a few weeks, they are entirely eradicated, never to return.
The removal of the Jews would lead to this forest being regarded as one of the first territories to become Jew-free, or as the SS called it, Judenfrei.
Thousands of the non-Jewish inhabitants are also expelled.
The forest was going to be completely barren of human beings, completely wilderness. And the only human beings that would go in there would be German hunters. And this then goes back to Julius Caesar's idea of bare-chested Germans with spears trying to run after an aurochs and killing it.
The Nazi obsession with the mythical origins of their Aryan ancestors is now being turned into a hellish reality.
Some would argue that the defining feature of Nazism is the centrality of myth in creating a national identity. And so in that sense, the scientific efforts to recreate the mythical landscape could be said to legitimate the violence in the East.
In Bialovieza, tens of thousands of people suffer from the consequences of these delusions. And in the midst of these deportations and executions, Dr. Lutz Heck visits the forest. Soon, he transfers his aurochs from Goering's hunting reserve, where they raise havoc, and releases them into their final destination, the ethnically cleansed forest of Bialovieza. After nearly 15 years of breeding, this is his moment of glory. Seemingly oblivious to the slaughter around him, Heck records in his memoirs,
"It was a long and laborious process that ultimately produced this fine, healthy stock of aurochs. Every year now, the cows of the breed bring new calves into the world. Thus, the new breed flourishes and grows."
Heck begins turning Bialovieza into one vast wildlife laboratory. In this new Germania, he releases bears, breeds bisons, and experiments with wild horses for his tarpan breeding program in Germany. As the breeding experiments continue, Airman Goering replaces the police battalions with special units of Luftwaffe troops to continue the task of hunting down escaped Jews and fighting partisans. On March 30th, 1943, leading a hunting patrol in the western part of the forest, Corporal Rudolf Trebus describes spotting a group of partisans, including a woman standing around a campfire at a distance of 65 yards. Trebus's patrol creeps up closer before he splits his force into two groups. He then leads a charge, killing 5 partisans, including the women. If the partisans happened to be Jews, they left them where they were.
They kill 139 Jews on wild hunting missions and individuals, and even taking the names of the individual Jews that they're slaughtering like animals and leaving their bodies in the ground so that they are a warning to other Jews to not come in the forest.
As the war draws on, it becomes increasingly clear that the same forest that provides a sanctuary for wild animals is providing good cover for partisans to fight a guerrilla war. In 3 years of fighting, the Germans never gained full control of the forest. By 1945, outside the Bialovieza forest, the tide of the war is turning against Germany. The Nazi map of Eastern Europe rapidly unravels as the Soviet armies force the Germans to retreat towards Berlin. Most of the city is destroyed by bombing, including Heck's breeding facilities in Berlin Zoo. Although some zoo animals survive, the products of Lutz Heck's breeding programs, including his aurochs, disappear without a trace, possibly eaten by hungry Berliners and Russian soldiers. What happens to Heck's aurochs in Bialovieza is still a mystery.
After the war, some of them are sad to have remained there and to have lived through all the war, all the fighting that had happened. Some of them are reported to still linger throughout Bialovieza, at least for a few years, and after that nobody heard of them anymore.
Others believe that, as Nazi creations, their fate is sealed.
I believe the aurochs were slaughtered by the partisans or by Soviet officials. I do believe that just as the Germans believed that certain animals were Germanic, I do believe that the Soviets thought that they were not having Germanic ill-breeds running around in their forest.
In May 1945, Airman Goering is captured by American forces in Bavaria. He later commits suicide during the Nuremberg war crimes trials. The entire truth of the massacres in Bialovieza remains undiscovered until after his death. After the war, Lutz Heck is investigated for being a prominent Nazi official. He is subsequently exonerated as a mere follower rather than a war criminal. Both he and his brother continued their careers as zoologists, dying in the early 1980s. The primeval forest where Goering and Heck planned to create the new Germania still flourishes as a vast nature reserve, now shared between Poland and Belarus. Bialovieza is still a major sanctuary for rare wildlife, including a large population of European bison. In the forests, marshes, and meadows of Europe, the descendants of the cattle that Lutz and his brother bred still thrive, as they do, apparently, bear some resemblance to the descriptions of the ancient aurochs.
You see here is a fine specimen of a Heck cattle. You can see the yellow eel stripe running across its back. You can see the horns protruding outwards and then forwards, which was exactly what Lutz and Heinz were looking for. That's what they imagined the aurochs must have looked like. I can see the animals are quite fierce. This one looks very calm, but I'm a bit hesitant to go any closer to it.
Despite physical similarity to their ancestors, scientists say they are no closer genetically than any other domestic cattle.
The truth is that the animals that the Heck brothers bred are probably not very similar to these animals in any way. They did their best to sort of, change the external packaging, but actually what's inside the box was probably not very similar.
To try and get your way through the maze of descent, which connects modern cattle with the ancient aurochs, is effectively impossible. You can fool yourself easily, and plenty of people have fooled themselves, by making an animal that looks a bit like what you imagine the ancient aurochs to be. But I can tell you one thing with complete confidence, it ain't an aurochs.
This breed is now referred to as Heck's cattle, to distinguish them from the original aurochs. To others, the fact that they remain products of a Nazi breeding program justifies calling them Hitler's cows.
When you're talking about the Heck cattle and the bison and these allegedly primitive breeds, they're strangely tainted for some people, but they're just cows. They're not higher or lower. They're cattle of a different kind.
These false aurochs are first bred into existence as a result of the same romantic myths and legends that inspired the awful Nazi obsession with racial purity. Both projects are failures.
If you look back at that really dismal period in human endeavors, when biology and politics became the same thing, and that's always a big, big mistake, that has really polluted both human genetics and animal breeding ever since. Now, that's no longer true. Human genetics is very much alive and well.
And animal genetics has moved on too. The remains of these ancient beasts now provide the DNA which one day could enable scientists to clone a real aurochs. Once again, 7-foot bulls may indeed roam the forests. As Julius Caesar warned, sparing neither man nor wild beast.